The silence on my birthday was a heavy blanket, thicker and colder than the winter air outside my window. 60 years. 6 decades of drawing breath on this earth, and the only sound in my small, quiet house was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. A relic from a time when birthdays in this family felt like milestones, not footnotes. I made my tea, the familiar ritual, a small comfort in the face of the gnawing emptiness. No calls, no cards. Not even a perfunctory text message. My daughter, Sarah, usually so diligent with digital greetings, her fingers flying across a screen even when her attention was clearly elsewhere, was silent. My son Tom, always more wrapped up in his own bustling life, his calls infrequent and brief, offering apologies before they were even missed, also offered nothing. Their spouses, whom I had tried to welcome and love as my own, were equally absent from my thoughts, their silence a reflection of my children's. It wasn't just a forgotten day, it was the culmination of a lifetime of being overlooked, of my voice being the quietest in a room full of booming needs and self-important pronouncements. I sat by the window, watching the gray sky promise nothing, feeling the familiar ache settle deep in my chest. It wasn't a sharp pain, but a dull, persistent throb, like a bruise that never quite heals. I had always been the one to remember the birthdays, the anniversaries, the small triumphs, the minor surgeries, the job promotions that barely registered on my radar, but meant the world to them. I sent the cards, I made the calls, I knitted the scarves that were probably shoved in a drawer somewhere. I drove the miles for the obligatory holiday gatherings, where I was often a quiet observer, listening to them discuss their lives, their problems, their plans, none of which seemed to include much thought for me beyond my utility. My utility, that was it, wasn't it? The quiet mother, the obliging grandmother, the reliable presence who could be counted on for a listening ear, a bit of free childcare in a pinch, or maybe, just maybe, the eventual dispenser of a modest inheritance. That was the unspoken agreement, the foundation of our relationship as it had evolved over the years. They built their vibrant, busy lives, and I was a static figure in the background, a piece of furniture they expected to remain exactly where they left me, dusted off occasionally for show or need. The thought brought a wry, bitter smile to my lips. They saw me as a fixture, a part of the landscape, reliable and unchanging, without a life or desires, or critically, resources of my own. If they only knew. The secret I had carried for years, a heavy, silent companion, felt particularly poignant today. It wasn't a secret I had intended to keep forever, not from them at least, not initially. But as the years wore on, as their expectations became clearer, their attention to me dimmer, the secret had hardened, becoming less a surprise to be revealed, and more a shield to be held. It was a different kind of wealth than they imagined, born not of grand gestures or public acclaim, but of quiet perseverance, a bit of luck, and a lot of carefully managed discipline over a lifetime. Something they had no concept of, steeped as they were in their immediate needs and desires, their eyes always scanning the horizon for the next opportunity, the next person who could further their ambitions. I had seen their ambition up close, often directed with a surprising intensity at the potential windfalls of life, including the modest estate they assumed I would eventually leave behind. They discussed it, sometimes obliquely, sometimes with a jarring casualness, assuming I wasn't listening, or perhaps assuming I didn't mind. When Mom eventually, Tom had said once, trailing off with an awkward cough, while Sarah had interjected practically, "We'll need to think about selling the house. It's too much for one person anyway, the market is good." They didn't see the house as my home, the repository of my memories, the place where I felt most myself. They saw it as an asset to be liquidated, a stream of income to be rerouted into their own lives. It stung then, but today, the sting was different. It wasn't just hurt, it was clarity. The silence of my 60th birthday wasn't an oversight, it was a statement of where I ranked in their priorities, a confirmation of my diminishing importance in their busy worlds. And in that silence, sitting by my window with my forgotten milestone, the quiet hum of the old clock, the only witness, a different kind of thought began to form. A thought not born of sadness, but of something cool and clear, and undeniably potent. The blanket of silence might be heavy, but beneath it, something was stirring, something that had been dormant for a long time. It was the realization that the power they assumed resided in my eventual absence, in the assets they anticipated inheriting, had actually resided within me all along. And it was a power I was finally ready to acknowledge, and perhaps to wield. The tea grew cold in my cup, but I didn't notice. My gaze was fixed on the horizon, not the gray one outside, but one stretching further, wider, filled with possibilities they could never have imagined. My 60th birthday, the forgotten one, was turning out to be a birthday after all, the birth of something new. The history of neglect wasn't written in dramatic moments, but in the slow, steady erosion of attention, like a coastline worn away by tireless waves. It was in the way my suggestions were politely heard and immediately discarded, the way my opinions on their lives were sought only when they wanted validation, never genuine advice. It was in the pattern of phone calls that invariably ended with them needing something, a small loan, a favor, a place to stay for a night with little notice, followed by lengthy silences once the need was met. I remembered Sarah's wedding. I had offered to help with the planning, eager to be involved. She had smiled, patted my hand, and said, "Oh Mom, it's all handled. You just need to show up and look lovely." I wore the dress she picked, a color she deemed appropriate for the mother of the bride, and stood where I was told to stand for the photos. I felt like an accessory, a required prop in a scene where I had no lines and no real role beyond my biological one. Tom was different, less overtly dismissive, more passively absorbent of my efforts. He accepted my help, my small gifts, my offers of time, with a quiet gratitude that felt genuine in the moment, but was quickly forgotten. His life was a series of urgent demands: his career, his wife's career, his children's schooling, their extracurriculars. My life, in contrast, seemed to him a placid pool of free time, readily available for whatever small task he needed completed. "Mom, could you just pick up the kids from school? Sarah's got a last-minute meeting." "Of course." "Mom, could you read over this contract? You're good with details." I was, and I did. "Mom, we're swamped. Could you handle organizing the family reunion this year?" And I would, coordinating relatives I barely saw myself, sending out invitations, booking venues, all with little help, and even less appreciation. It was expected. It was my role. My role, as defined by them, was one of quiet support, unconditional availability, and negligible personal needs or desires. They never asked about my friends, my hobbies, my own health, with any real depth of interest. Conversations were dominated by their struggles, their achievements, their plans for the future, a future in which I featured primarily as a source of potential future funding. The assumption of my eventual inheritance was the unspoken current running beneath the surface of our interactions. They didn't know the full extent of my finances, of course. They knew about my comfortable, but not lavish, pension from my years working as a librarian. They knew about the house, mortgage-free, that had been in my family for generations. They saw my careful habits, the way I mended clothes, grew some of my own vegetables, drove an older car that ran perfectly well. They interpreted this not as prudence or a preference for simplicity, but as evidence of limited means. "Poor Mom," Sarah had once said to a relative, within earshot. "She never really had much opportunity." It was patronizing, condescending, and utterly wrong. My opportunity had come in a form they couldn't recognize, because they weren't looking for it. It wasn't a flashy career move, or a lucky lottery ticket. It was something much quieter, much more sustained. Years ago, long before my husband passed, a distant relative, Uncle Thomas, a man I barely knew, had left me a substantial sum. He was a recluse, a quiet investor, and I, for reasons never fully explained beyond a cryptic note about seeing genuine character, was the unexpected recipient of his considerable estate. It wasn't millions then, but it was a significant foundation. My husband, bless his practical soul, had wanted to buy a bigger house, travel the world. I had agreed to a few trips, enjoyed them immensely, but felt a deeper pull towards security and growth. I used the bulk of the inheritance wisely, advised by a shrewd, quiet man Uncle Thomas had recommended, Mr. Harrison, a financial advisor who valued discretion as much as I did. We invested carefully, steadily, over 2 decades. I lived my life, worked my job, raised my children, and watched as the numbers in a separate secret account grew, nurtured by time and smart decisions. It wasn't a secret I kept out of malice, but out of a sense of privacy, and later, a growing awareness of how it might change the dynamics of my family relationships, which were already complex enough. I saw how money could warp people, how expectations could sour gratitude. I wanted them to love me for me, not for what I had or what I might leave behind. A naive hope, perhaps, in hindsight. As they grew older, their own financial pressures mounting, their casual remarks about when you eventually downsize or making sure everything is in order became more frequent, less oblique. They talked about the rising cost of their children's education, the need for bigger homes, the desire for exotic holidays. Their problems were always presented as urgent, requiring sympathy and implicitly future solutions that might involve my assets. They never asked if I needed anything, if I had worries, if I had dreams for my own later years. My dreams, if I had any left in their eyes, were presumably limited to comfortable senescence within the familiar confines of my undemanding life, waiting patiently for the inevitable. The forgotten birthday wasn't just a lapse in memory, it was a symptom of this deeper reality. I had become so peripheral to their actual lives, so taken for granted as a reliable, unchanging part of their background, that even the simple act of acknowledging my passage through time had become an unnecessary effort. They didn't see me, they saw the idea of me, the placeholder for a role I was expected to fulfill, a role that ended, conveniently for them, with a distribution of assets. That the quiet woman they overlooked had a secret life, a secret strength, and a secret fortune. And on my 60th birthday, sitting in the silence they had created, the future they envisioned for me and for themselves began to dissolve, like mist in the morning sun, replaced by a future I would build myself, one deliberate step at a time. The silence stretched through the afternoon, unbroken by phone calls or unexpected visitors. I ate a simple lunch, a sandwich and a bowl of soup, the lack of fanfare feeling both stark and strangely liberating. There was no need to pretend, no forced cheerfulness, no managing of other people's expectations. Just me, the quiet house, and the hum of the refrigerator. The weight of the secret fortune, usually a dormant presence, felt different today. It wasn't just numbers in a bank account, it was potential energy, unspent and unacknowledged. For years I had viewed it as a source of security, a quiet reassurance in a world that often felt uncertain. I had lived well within my modest means, deriving satisfaction from the growth of the investments, from the knowledge that I was financially independent in a way few people understood. I didn't need their help, nor did I need their approval. What I had wanted, foolishly perhaps, was their genuine connection, their interest in me as a person, separate from any perceived financial benefit. The forgotten birthday extinguished that last flicker of hope. It was a definitive statement, and in its wake, the purpose of the fortune began to shift in my mind. It wasn't just security anymore, it was power, the power to choose, the power to act, the power to redirect a lifetime of accumulated value, both financial and personal, towards something somewhere that did recognize its worth. The idea, once a vague possibility floating on the periphery of my thoughts, began to solidify, taking on shape and weight. Spent my millions elsewhere. The phrase from the title, whispered to myself in the empty room, resonated with a surprising force. Elsewhere, where was elsewhere? Not on them, certainly, not on lavish trinkets or extravagant holidays. For myself, those things held little appeal. My tastes remained simple, honed by years of living a life that looked, from the outside, quite ordinary. The true luxury the money offered was freedom. Freedom from worry, yes, but also freedom from obligation, from expectation, from the subtle chains of familial duty, when that duty was clearly not reciprocated. I thought of the causes I cared about, the quiet charities that struggled for funding, the local initiatives that made a tangible difference in people's lives. I thought of the young people I had seen in the library over the years, hungry for knowledge but lacking resources. I thought of the elderly neighbors who struggled to maintain their homes, isolated and vulnerable. These were people who genuinely needed help, who might benefit immensely from resources directed their way. They were elsewhere, in a different sense, outside the narrow orbit of my immediate family, beyond the reach of their self-centered concerns. A sense of purpose, sharp and clear, began to emerge from the fog of hurt. For too long, my worth had been tied, in their eyes, to my potential as a future benefactor. My value was deferred, contingent upon my eventual demise. But my value existed now, my resources existed now, and I could choose to deploy them in a way that reflected my own values, my own priorities, the things and people I quietly cared about, rather than the people who loudly proclaimed their supposed affection while demonstrating their indifference. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. They cultivated me, the seemingly unassuming matriarch, like a potentially fruitful tree, expecting to harvest its yield in due course. They watered it with occasional, performative gestures of affection, pruned it of any branches that might indicate independent growth, like my quiet financial success, and waited for it to drop its fruit into their waiting hands. But this tree had been bearing fruit all along, a hidden bounty they were completely unaware of. And I was realizing, with a sense of growing exhilaration, mixed with a deep, abiding sadness for what might have been, that I didn't have to let them harvest it. I could choose to let the fruit fall elsewhere, nourishing ground they had never bothered to tend. The decision, not yet fully formed in its practical details, was crystallizing in its intent. The forgotten birthday, the silent milestone, was not an ending, but a beginning. The beginning of a different path, one I would walk alone, but with a strength and clarity I hadn't possessed before. The quiet woman, invisible in their eyes, was about to become the architect of a future they couldn't control, a future built not on expectation and entitlement, but on deliberate choice and quiet resolve. The wealth was not just money, it was leverage. And I was finally ready to use it. The first step felt daunting, like standing on the edge of a precipice, but also exhilarating. It involved a phone call I had postponed for too long. Mr. Harrison, my discreet financial advisor, a man who had guided my investments with quiet competence for 20 years, respecting my privacy and understanding my desire for anonymity. His voice, when he answered, was calm and measured, a balm to my slightly frayed nerves. "Eleanor, good to hear from you. How can I help?" I took a deep breath. "Mr. Harrison, I need to make some significant changes." "Quite significant," I explained, without dwelling on the emotional catalyst, that I wished to begin the process of distributing a large portion of my assets. Not through inheritance planning, I stressed, but through immediate, structured giving. There was a brief pause on the line. "Eleanor, forgive me, but this is unexpected. You've always been so focused on long-term growth and security." "My priorities have shifted," I said, the words feeling steady and strong. "The long term I was planning for no longer holds the same significance." I didn't need to explain further. He was a professional, not a confidant. I outlined the general scale of the distribution I was considering. Even over the phone, I could sense his surprise. He knew I was comfortable, but perhaps hadn't grasped the full extent of the growth over 2 decades of quiet compounding. The amount I mentioned was clearly far beyond the modest estate my children envisioned. We scheduled a meeting. The practical steps required a different kind of strength than enduring quiet neglect. It meant wading into the formal world of trusts, foundations, and legal documentation. Mr. Harrison recommended a lawyer, a Mrs. Davies, known for her discretion and expertise in philanthropic law. My meeting with Mrs. Davies was even more formal. She was sharp, intelligent, and entirely focused on the legal complexities. I sat across from her, a woman who had spent years being seen as gentle and perhaps a little naive by her family, discussing sums of money that would change countless lives. I explained my wishes, specific amounts to various charities I had researched, funds to establish scholarships, endowments for local community projects. I wanted structure, oversight, ensuring the money was used effectively for the purposes I intended. I also explained my desire for a degree of anonymity, at least initially. "I prefer the focus to be on the work the funds enable, not on the donor," I said. This was partly true. I didn't seek public accolades, but it was also practical. I wasn't ready for my family to know, not yet. Not until everything was irrevocably in motion. Mrs. Davies, a woman who likely dealt with the motivations of the wealthy every day, simply nodded, taking precise notes. And what about future provisions? She asked delicately, referring to my children. I had anticipated this question. I have made provisions for my own care in the future, should it be necessary, I said. Beyond that, I believe my children are capable adults, well established in their own lives and careers. They do not require further financial support from me. The words hung in the air. It was the formal, legal articulation of the decision I had made in the silence of my birthday. It felt stark, perhaps even harsh, put into plain legal terms. But it was also the truth. They hadn't invested in a relationship with me. They had invested in an expectation of inheritance. Now that investment was yielding no return. The process of setting up the trusts and foundations was complex and time-consuming. There were documents to review, decisions to finalize, bank transfers to arrange. Each signature felt like a deliberate stroke, severing a tie to a future that would now never materialize for them. Meanwhile, life with my family continued in its usual rhythm, or lack thereof. Sarah called a week late, with a breezy, "Oh Mom, I am so sorry about your birthday. It was just one of those weeks. You understand, right? Everything was crazy with the kids and work." Not, I forgot, but it was one of those weeks. The subtle deflection, the assumption of my easy forgiveness, the framing of her neglect as an unavoidable consequence of her busy, important life. "Yes, Sarah," I said, my voice even, perhaps a little quieter than usual. "I understand." I understood more than she knew. Tom sent a belated text, a few days after Sarah's call. "Happy belated birthday, Mom. Hope it was good. Sorry things are nuts here. Talk soon." Talk soon meant whenever he next needed something. The lack of genuine remorse, the casual dismissal of the milestone, reinforced the rightness of my path. They were so absorbed in the narratives of their own demanding lives that they couldn't even register the impact of their actions, or lack thereof, on mine. The tension was building, though they were oblivious. I was quietly orchestrating a massive shift in my financial landscape, a landscape they believed was static, merely awaiting their claim. Every document signed, every transfer initiated, was a step further away from their expected future, a step closer to the elsewhere I was creating. The quiet strength I had always possessed, the resilience that had seen me through various challenges, was now directed with a singular focus. I was no longer waiting to be seen. I was acting, shaping my own reality, ensuring that my life's accumulated value would serve a purpose I chose, a purpose that extended far beyond the narrow confines of familial obligation and forgotten birthdays. The irony wasn't lost on me. As they busied themselves with their lives, secure in their assumptions about the future, I was dismantling that future piece by piece, not out of spite, but out of a profound realization that my worth and my resources deserved to be directed where they were truly needed, truly valued, by people who wouldn't take them for granted. The physical act of signing the papers felt monumental. Page after page, my signature flowed, authorizing the transfer of sums that represented years of careful management, quiet growth, and deferred desires. It wasn't just money changing hands. It felt like I was redirecting a river, altering the course of a significant force that had flowed quietly beside me for so long. Mrs. Davies guided me through the process with calm efficiency. She explained the structure of the charitable trusts, the endowment funds, the scholarship criteria I had decided upon. We discussed the governance, the timelines for distribution, the reporting requirements. It was complex, detailed work, requiring focus and a steady hand. With each signature, I felt a sense of purpose deepening, replacing the lingering ache of betrayal. This wasn't revenge, not in the simple hot-blooded sense. It was a reclamation of my agency, my values, my right to determine the legacy of my own life and work. I thought of the causes the money would support: a local women's shelter, an environmental conservation group, a scholarship fund for students pursuing studies in neglected fields like library science and historical preservation, areas close to my heart from my own career.
These were places and people who understood the value of quiet work, of preserving what is often overlooked, of providing refuge for the vulnerable. They were the opposite of the superficiality and self-interest I had experienced. One endowment was for a community garden project in an underserved part of the city, a place where people worked the earth, shared the harvest, and built connections. The symbolism wasn't lost on me.
I was planting seeds elsewhere, cultivating growth in fertile ground, far from the barren landscape of expectation and entitlement I had left behind. As the process moved forward, I maintained my usual routine. I went to the grocery store, attended my book club, tended my small garden to the outside world. And certainly to my family, I was still the quiet, unassuming Mrs. Eleanor Vance, living her predictable life. And this internal versus external contrast was sharp, almost surreal. On the one hand, I was orchestrating the transfer of millions, establishing complex financial structures that would operate long after I was gone. On the other, I was debating the merits of different types of mulch with a neighbor. It required a quiet discipline, a careful compartmentalization of my life. The tension lay in the knowledge that this calm facade would eventually crack, that the world my family inhabited would collide with the reality I was creating. I didn't know exactly how they would find out, or when. Part of me dreaded the confrontation, the inevitable accusations and expressions of disbelief and hurt. Their hurt, of course, never mine. Another part, a smaller, steelier part, felt a grim satisfaction in anticipating the moment their assumptions were shattered. They had built their expectations on a foundation of sand, their own limited perception of me. Now the tide was coming in. My interactions with Sarah and Tom remained superficial. Sarah called, usually to complain about a minor inconvenience or seek validation for a parenting decision. Tom called, usually needing a piece of information or a small favor. Neither asked about my day, my health, my feelings. I answered their questions, offered brief, non-committal responses, and ended the calls politely. There was no warmth, no genuine curiosity, just the mechanical performance of a duty they seemed to feel entitled to, while simultaneously neglecting their own side of the relationship. The contrast between their apparent lives, full of social engagements, career milestones, their children's activities, and the hidden life I was leading, the massive financial and emotional shift I was undergoing, was stark. They were busy, yes, but busy with things that seemed from my new perspective strangely hollow. They pursued external validation, material accumulation, the appearance of success, while neglecting the deeper connections, the quiet acts of care that actually build a life worth living. I realized that their neglect of me wasn't just about me, it was a reflection of their own priorities, their own values. They valued achievement, status, and potential financial gain above all else. Affection was conditional, attention a resource to be dispensed strategically, and family a network of utility. It was a bleak realization, but also a freeing one. It removed the need to seek their approval, their attention, their love. It wasn't that I was unlovable. It was that they were incapable of loving in the way I needed, the way any parent hopes to be loved, for simply being, for the history shared, for the quiet bond that exists beyond transactions. The money, the millions they coveted and overlooked the source of, had become a tool for my own liberation. It allowed me to exit their game, to stop playing the role they had assigned me, and to redefine my own purpose and value. It wasn't about punishing them, it was about freeing myself. And the quiet satisfaction of that freedom, earned through years of silent observation and finally decisive action, was a powerful force sustaining me through the complex emotional process of giving my fortune elsewhere. Executing the plan required meticulous attention to detail. There were deeds to transfer, accounts to close, legal structures to finalize. Mrs. Davies and Mr. Harrison worked seamlessly together, two calm professionals navigating the intricacies of vast sums and legal requirements. I reviewed every document, asked questions, ensured that my intentions were precisely translated into legal reality. It was empowering to feel so in control of my own affairs, a stark contrast to the passive role I had played in my family's narratives for so long. I signed the final documents, creating the Eleanor Vance Charitable Foundation. The name itself felt significant. It put my name, the name they had so often overlooked or taken for granted, on something substantial, something that would have a lasting impact. The foundation's mission statement, which I had carefully crafted, reflected my values: supporting education, environmental conservation, and community welfare, with a particular focus on overlooked populations and quiet, impactful initiatives. It was a statement of my life's priorities, etched in legal stone, funded by the wealth they never knew existed. There was also a separate, smaller trust established for my grandchildren, specifically for their education, to be administered by an independent trustee when they reached college age. This wasn't a large sum compared to the rest, but it was meaningful. It was a nod to the future generation, a chance for them perhaps to benefit from something their parents had dismissed, but structured in a way that bypassed the parents' direct control or potential mismanagement. It felt like planting a tiny seed of hope, independent of the tangled roots of my relationship with my children. The bulk of the fortune, however, was directed elsewhere, to the causes, the organizations, the endowments that would carry out the work I believed in. There was no fanfare, no press releases planned, at least not initiated by me. The transfers were made, the legal structures were in place, the money was no longer sitting in my personal accounts. It was a quiet revolution, executed with precision and discretion. During this time, my interactions with Sarah and Tom remained utterly consistent. Sarah called to ask if I could contribute to a fundraiser for her son's sports team. Tom called to see if I still had a particular tool he needed to borrow. They were oblivious, sailing along on the surface of their lives, completely unaware of the tectonic shifts happening beneath the placid waters of my own. Their calls felt increasingly like echoes from a distant shore, irrelevant to the voyage I was now undertaking. I found myself listening to them with a new perspective, a detachment that felt both sad and necessary. Their problems seemed small, their concerns self-generated, their focus incredibly narrow. They complained about money, about needing more, about the injustices of not having everything they felt entitled to. The irony was almost unbearable. They grumbled about the cost of living while the inheritance they expected, the safety net they assumed would cushion their futures, was being purposefully and quietly redirected towards genuine need. I felt no urge to tell them, no desire to drop hints or gauge their reactions. The time for seeking their understanding or validation was long past. This was my decision, my life, my money. The power dynamic had shifted, not through confrontation, but through quiet, decisive action. I held the power now, not because of the money itself, but because I had chosen to use it according to my own will, independent of their expectations. One afternoon, Sarah called, sounding stressed. "Mom, I was just thinking, have you updated your will recently? I mean, you're 60 now. It's probably a good idea to make sure everything is in order. You know, for when the time comes." There it was again, when the time comes. My eventual death, framed as a logistical event, requiring my administrative attention for their benefit. The casualness, the assumption of my cooperation in planning for their future gain, was breathtaking. "Yes, Sarah," I said, my voice calm, "my affairs are in order." A simple statement, factually true, yet layered with a meaning she couldn't possibly grasp. "Oh good," she said, sounding relieved. "Just wanted to make sure. You never know, right? She chuckled. A light, careless sound. You never know, indeed. She had no idea how much she didn't know. The call soon devolved into her discussing a problem with her car and hinting heavily that she might need help with the repair costs. I listened patiently, offered sympathy, but made no offer of financial assistance. The old pattern was still there, but my response was different. I was no longer the automatic source of solutions to their problems. The money was gone, effectively, earmarked, committed, flowing elsewhere. The knowledge of this shift, held internally, gave me a quiet strength. I didn't need to argue or explain. I simply needed to act according to my new reality. The tension of maintaining the facade was real, a constant undercurrent, but it was manageable, fueled by the purpose driving me forward. The money was moving, the future was being reshaped, and the silent woman they thought they knew was finally living a life on her own terms, making choices that reflected her true self, unseen and unburdened by their expectations. The moment of discovery arrived not with a bang, but a series of confused phone calls, escalating in tone and urgency. It started with Tom. "Mom, hey, listen. Something weird is going on. I got a call from Mr. Harrison's office today. Something about probate. But everything is fine with you, right?" His voice was tinged with confusion, the first crack in his assumption of my static existence. "Probate?" I asked, feigning mild surprise. "Why would they call you about probate?" "I don't know. That's what I'm asking. They mentioned something about you redirecting assets, and then my name came up in relation to some trust. It didn't make any sense. Are you okay? Did you change your will?" The questions tumbled out, rapid fire, laced with a thinly veiled anxiety that wasn't about my well-being, but about their perceived interests. "My will is up to date, Tom," I said calmly. "As I told Sarah recently, my affairs are in order. But redirecting assets, what does that even mean? Are you selling the house? Are you giving money away?" The casual assumption that any financial activity on my part must be either preparing for inheritance or some ill-advised giveaway was evident. "I've made some decisions regarding my financial future," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Decisions that affect my assets. But what about us? What about the inheritance?" He blurted it out, the unspoken expectation finally given voice, raw and unvarnished. The silence on my end stretched for a moment. This was it, the moment of reckoning. "Tom," I said softly, but clearly, "there is no inheritance." The line went dead silent. I waited, then the sound of his breathing, heavy and shocked. What do you mean, no inheritance? You have the house. You have your pension, Uncle Thomas's money. What did you do?" The shock was quickly giving way to anger, entitlement, a sense of profound injustice. "Uncle Thomas's money was managed carefully, Tom," I said, my voice remaining steady despite the tremor in my hands. "It grew substantially over the years. I have used it, and other assets, to establish charitable foundations and endowments. The majority of my wealth is now allocated to those purposes." "Charitable foundations? Are you serious? You gave it all away." His voice was rising, incredulous. "You gave away our money, the money that was supposed to be ours. Our money." The possessiveness was stunning and telling. "It was never your money, Tom," I said, a quiet strength filling my voice. "It was always my money, earned, inherited, and managed by me, and I have chosen to use it to support causes that are important to me." "But why? Why would you do that? We're your family. We needed that money, for the kids, for our future." The torrent of his protest was fueled by disbelief and self-pity. "You needed it?" I asked gently, injecting a note of bittersweet irony. "Did you? When was the last time you needed me, Tom? Truly needed me, not for a favor or a loan or child care. When did you last ask about my life, my health, my hopes? When did you last remember my birthday?" The question hung in the air, a silent accusation more powerful than any shouted word. He stammered, tried to deflect. "That's not fair. We're busy. You know how it is." "Yes, Tom," I said. I know how it is. I've known for a long time. I explained, briefly and factually, about the foundations, the scholarships, the endowments. I mentioned the small education trust for the grandchildren, noting it would be independently managed. His reaction to the grandchildren's trust was telling, not gratitude for their future, but resentment that it wasn't available to him now, filtered through him. The conversation with Sarah, when she finally called, was even more dramatic. Hysteria, accusations of cruelty, claims of manipulation. How could you do this, Mom? After everything we've done for you, everything they'd done for me. The selective memory, the inversion of reality was breathtaking. Done for me, I repeated, my voice quiet but firm. What exactly have you done for me, Sarah? Ignored my calls, forgotten my milestones, treated my home like a hotel and me like a convenient resource, discussed my eventual death as a financial opportunity. She cried, she shouted, she called me selfish, cold, vindictive, words that might have wounded me deeply in the past, but now felt like the impotent flailings of someone whose carefully constructed world had just imploded. I listened, absorbing the accusations, the anger, the complete lack of understanding or empathy for my feelings, my lifetime of quiet hurt. They saw only the loss of the expected money, the disruption of their assumed future. They could not, or would not, see the mother they had neglected, the person whose needs they had consistently ignored. The tension of the past weeks, of holding the secret and executing the plan, began to dissipate, replaced by a strange calm. The truth was out. The future they had taken for granted was gone, and I was free. Their reactions escalated from shock to anger, then to a calculated campaign of guilt, manipulation, and attempts to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Sarah, ever the dramatist, posted vague passive-aggressive updates on social media about unforeseen family difficulties and disappointments that cut deep, clearly angling for sympathy from extended family or mutual acquaintances. Tom, more direct, repeatedly called, sometimes pleading, sometimes demanding, questioning my mental state, suggesting I had been taken advantage of by some lawyer or financial advisor. He even threatened legal action, baseless as it was. You can't just give away everything. There are laws, spousal claims, children's entitlements. He didn't understand, couldn't comprehend, that the money had been mine, earned or inherited, outside of their father's estate, which had been modest and divided years ago, and that I was of sound mind, acting entirely within my legal rights. My interactions with them became brief, factual, and devoid of emotional engagement on my part. I reiterated that my decisions were final, legally executed, and not subject to negotiation. I refused to explain my motivations further. They had had a lifetime to understand, and had chosen not to. I listened to their accusations and justifications with a detached air. We were busy, Mom. Raising families is hard. You never told us you had that kind of money. How could you do this without consulting us? Their protests circled back to their needs, their expectations, their perceived rights. There was no acknowledgement of their neglect, no apology for the forgotten birthday or the years of taking me for granted. Their focus was solely on the loss of the anticipated financial windfall. It highlighted, more clearly than anything else could have, the transactional nature of their relationship with me. When the potential transaction was cancelled, the relationship, such as it was, soured completely. Extended family, sensing the shift, began to weigh in, their allegiances clearly drawn along lines of potential future benefit. Some cousins called, offering hesitant support, having witnessed the family dynamics over the years. Others sided firmly with Sarah and Tom, tut-tutting about my supposed coldness and the fairness of inheritance. It was painful, but not surprising. Money, or the lack of it, had a way of revealing true character, or the lack thereof. I withdrew somewhat from these wider circles, preferring the quiet company of the few true friends I had cultivated over the years, people who valued me for who I was, not for what I had. I also found a new sense of connection through the causes I was supporting. I met with the directors of the women's shelter, saw the safe haven the funds were helping to provide. I walked through the community garden, talking to the volunteers whose efforts cultivated not just vegetables, but community spirit. I met some of the first scholarship recipients, bright, hopeful young people whose paths to education had been made possible by the foundation. These interactions were profoundly moving, offering a sharp contrast to the draining negativity emanating from my family. These were people who expressed genuine gratitude, who saw the impact of the resources, who valued the opportunity created. They were the elsewheres that had become my focus, my purpose. The quiet acts of giving, the knowledge that my resources were making a tangible difference in the lives of people I would likely never meet, filled a space within me that had been hollowed out by years of familial disappointment. It wasn't a perfect self, the sadness for the family I had lost, or perhaps never truly had remained, but it was tempered by a sense of profound rightness, of having finally aligned my actions with my deepest values. My home, once a place that felt heavy with the weight of unspoken expectations and overlooked presence, now felt lighter, freer. It was still my haven, filled with my memories and my quiet routines, but the future it represented was no longer tied to the expectations of others. I had secured my own needs, ensuring I would not be a burden, and the rest, the vast majority, was serving a purpose I had chosen. The inversion of the power dynamic was complete. They had assumed control of my future through their expectation of inheritance. I had reclaimed control by redirecting that future towards my own chosen path. They were left with their anger and their entitlement, while I was left with a quiet peace and the profound satisfaction of having acted authentically, aligning my final significant act with a lifetime of being quietly undervalued, turning that experience into a force for good. Elsewhere, the irony was still potent, but now it tasted less of bitterness and more of a sharp, clear understanding of human nature and my own resilience. The dust settled, not completely, but enough for a new pattern to emerge. Sarah and Tom's calls became less frequent, their tone shifting from anger to a resentful silence punctuated by occasional stiff exchanges about logistics that couldn't be avoided. Family gatherings, previously awkward but attended out of a sense of duty, became opportunities for pointed avoidance and thinly veiled hostility. I attended a niece's wedding and felt like a ghost, polite smiles not quite reaching the eyes of some relatives, my own children keeping a careful distance, their expressions a mixture of embarrassment and lingering resentment. It was painful, a confirmation of the depth of the rift, but also removed any remaining illusion about the nature of our relationship. The transactional bond was broken, and there wasn't enough genuine connection beneath it to hold us together in the way a family should be. The house, the symbolic object they had seen as merely an asset for liquidation, remained mine. I continued to live there, tending the garden, reading in the quiet rooms, the grandfather clock marking the passage of time without judgment. It no longer felt like a waiting room for my eventual departure, but simply my home, a place of peace and reflection. I focused my energy on the work of the foundation. I served on the board, actively participating in the decision-making, meeting the people whose lives were touched by the funds. This was where my families had gone, not in the biological sense, but in a sense of shared purpose and genuine connection. I found kinship with the dedicated individuals who ran the charities, the passionate educators, the tireless community organizers. They saw me not as a source of potential wealth, but as a partner, someone whose vision and resources helped enable their vital work. The gratitude I encountered here was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the silent expectation or vocal entitlement I had been used to. It wasn't effusive or performative. It was quiet, sincere appreciation for the opportunity to do good in the world. I visited the places the foundation supported, the renovated wing of the women's shelter, now offering more safe beds, the vibrant community garden, flourishing under the sun, the university library archive, receiving much-needed preservation funds,
safeguarding history for future generations. Seeing the tangible impact of the money filled me with a deep, quiet satisfaction. This was the harvest of my life's work, not left to wither on the vine of neglect and entitlement, but directed towards fertile ground, where it could truly flourish and benefit others. The bittersweetness remained. There were moments, quiet evenings alone, when I missed the idea of the family I had wanted, the easy warmth, the unconditional love that hadn't materialized. I saw other families interacting, children calling their parents just to chat, dropping by for impromptu visits, sharing simple moments of connection, and a pang of longing would surface. But these moments were fleeting, quickly replaced by the knowledge that the alternative, continuing to be overlooked, undervalued, and seen primarily as a future resource, was a far more painful existence. I had chosen a different path, a path of authenticity and self-respect, even if it meant walking it mostly alone. My 60th birthday, the catalyst for this profound shift, felt now not like a day of abandonment, but a day of awakening. The silence hadn't been an ending, but a space in which I could finally hear my own voice, my own needs, my own quiet strength. The decision to spend my millions elsewhere wasn't just a financial transaction. It was a declaration of independence, a testament to resilience, and a conscious act of creating meaning and purpose in the face of neglect. It was dark, in a way, severing those ties so definitively. There was a finality to it, a mourning for the family relationship that would never be what I had hoped. But it was also redemptive. Redemptive for me, reclaiming my agency and directing my energy towards positive impact. I hadn't sought revenge, but in asserting my own worth and values, I had, perhaps inevitably, disrupted the assumptions and expectations of those who had failed to see me. And in that disruption, I had found a quiet, profound empowerment. My life, no longer defined by their oversight, was now defined by my own deliberate choices, my own quiet strength, and the enduring impact of resources directed towards a world that truly needed them. The silence on my birthday had been the end of one story, but it was also the beginning of a richer, more meaningful one. A story about finding value, not in what others grant you, but in what you choose to cultivate and give elsewhere.